Part 1. The Forge of the Steppe, 1162 to 1206 AD. The story of the modern world does not begin in the marble halls of Europe or the crowded courts of the Ming dynasty. It begins in the dust and the biting wind of the Central Asian steppe in the late 12th century. To understand how the map was reset, we must first look at a world that was fundamentally broken. In the year 1160, Eurasia was a fractured mosaic of isolated civilizations. The Great Silk Road, which had once flourished under the Romans and the Han, was a ghost of its former self. It was a dangerous, jagged path controlled by hundreds of petty warlords, nomadic tribes, and mountain bandits. If a merchant wanted to move silk from Chang'an to Antioch, he had to pay protection money every 50 miles, navigate tribal blood feuds, and pray that the local Khan didn't decide to simply seize his life and cargo. This fragmentation wasn't just economic, it was intellectual. Knowledge was trapped in silos. The genius of Chinese medicine remained in China. The brilliance of Islamic mathematics remained in the caliphates. The iron-working secrets of the West remained in the forest kingdoms. There was no global consciousness. There were only local worlds, each convinced they were the center of a flat and terrifying universe. Into this chaos, a boy named Temujin was born. His early life was a masterclass in the brutality of a world without order. His father, Yesugei, was poisoned by the Tatars, and his family was abandoned by their own Borjigin tribe to starve on the frozen plains. He was a refugee in his own land, eating roots and field mice to survive. He was later captured and enslaved by the Taichi Ud, forced to wear a wooden collar. This environment forged a specific kind of genius, one that realized that tribalism, the very thing his people held sacred, was actually a death sentence. Temujin's rise to power was not just a series of battles, it was a profound social revolution. He broke the ancient bloodline system of the Mongols, where only the aristocratic sons of chiefs could lead. Instead, he implemented a strict meritocracy. He declared that the spoils of war would be shared among the soldiers, not just the leaders, and that the families of fallen warriors would be cared for by the state. If you were a commoner, but you were the best archer or the most loyal scout, you became a general. This created a level of loyalty never before seen in nomadic history. By 1206, Temujin had done the impossible. He had unified the warring tribes of the Mongol plateau. At a great assembly, or Kurultai, held at the headwaters of the Onon River, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He stood before his people and declared that they would no longer fight each other. Instead, they would look outward, under the eternal blue sky, to bring the world into a single law-governed order. This was the birth of the Yasa, the secret code of laws that forbade kidnapping, cattle theft, and religious persecution, providing the legal framework for a world-spanning empire. Part 2. The Unstoppable Machine, 1206 to 1227 AD. Genghis Khan did not just lead an army, he engineered a machine. The Mongol military was the first truly modern army in history, operating on a decimal system of units called Arban, 10 men, Zun, 100, Mingan, 1,000, and Tumen, 10,000. Every soldier was a horseman, and every horseman was a master of the composite bow. This weapon, made of layers of horn, wood, and animal sinew, was a marvel of pre-modern physics. It could fire an arrow with enough force to pierce armor at over 200 yards, and a Mongol archer could fire up to 6 aimed arrows per minute while in full gallop. Their greatest advantage, however, was mobility and psychological warfare. While European knights were encased in 60 pounds of steel and required a massive support staff, the Mongol warrior was self-sufficient. He wore light silk and leather, which interestingly helped prevent infections by wrapping around arrowheads as they entered the skin, making them easier to pull out. He traveled with a string of 5 or 6 horses, switching between them mid-stride. This allowed the Mongol army to move 70 to 100 miles in a single day. To their enemies, it appeared as though the Mongols were capable of teleporting across the landscape. The first major reset of the map occurred when Genghis turned his attention to the Jin dynasty in northern China. Here, the nomads faced their greatest challenge, the Great Wall and the massive, stone-walled cities of the east. The Mongols adapted with terrifying speed. They realized that they didn't need to know how to build siege engines if they could capture the people who did. They created a dedicated corps of engineers, capturing Chinese specialists and giving them a choice: innovate or perish. Within years, a nomadic army that had never seen a city was using sophisticated traction trebuchets and early gunpowder thunder crash bombs to level the walls of their enemies. The turning point for the Western world came in 1218. Genghis Khan sent a massive trade caravan of 450 merchants to the Khwarezmian Empire, which ruled over modern-day Iran and Uzbekistan. He sent a message to the Sultan: "I am the master of the rising sun, and you are the master of the setting sun. Let there be a firm treaty of friendship and commerce between us." But the local governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, made a catastrophic error. He accused the merchants of spying, executed them, and seized their goods. When Genghis sent diplomats to demand justice, the Sultan shaved their beards and sent back the head of the lead envoy. The Mongol response was a campaign of such calculated destruction that it fundamentally shifted the demographics of the Middle East. Genghis didn't just defeat the Khwarezmian army, he dismantled their civilization. The Mongols used living shields, captives forced to march in front of the army to take the brunt of city defenses. They diverted rivers to wash away entire urban centers and destroyed the Khanate, underground irrigation systems that made the desert bloom. By 1221, the borders of Central Asia had been erased, and the Mongol Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Yellow Sea. Part 3. The Global Postal Service and the European Shock, 1227 to 1242 AD. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief, assuming the nomadic empire would fracture. They were wrong. Under his son, Ögedei, the empire expanded with even greater institutional discipline. Ögedei realized that an empire this large could not be ruled from the back of a horse alone. He built a permanent capital at Karakoram, bringing in architects from every conquered land. He established the Yam postal system, the most significant logistical achievement of the era. This network consisted of over 1,500 relay stations, each stocked with fresh horses and supplies. It acted as the Amazon of the 13th century, a messenger, riding day and night and wrapping his torso in tight bandages to protect his internal organs from the constant jarring of the gallop, could travel from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Pacific in less than a month. This allowed the Great Khan to receive news of a rebellion in Poland and a harvest in China simultaneously, maintaining a level of centralized control that no Roman emperor could have imagined. In 1236, the Great Khan turned his legendary generals, Subutai and Batu, toward the west. Subutai, often considered the greatest military strategist in history, devised a plan to conquer Russia. They waited for the winter, using the frozen rivers as highways for their cavalry, a feat no other army in history has successfully replicated on that scale. They decimated the Russian principalities, burning Kiev in 1240. This began the era of the Golden Horde. Russia was effectively cut off from the development of Western Europe for 2 centuries, forced into a state of vassalage. However, this also forced the Russian princes to consolidate their power in Moscow to facilitate tax collection for the Mongols, inadvertently creating the foundation for the future Russian Empire. By 1241, the Mongols had reached the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. At the Battle of Legnica and the Battle of Mohi, they annihilated the combined chivalry of Poland, Germany, and Hungary in a single week. The knights of Europe, slow and bogged down in heavy plate armor, were picked apart by Mongol horse archers who used smoke screens and complex signal flags to coordinate their movements. Europe was completely open. The Pope and the kings of the West began to prepare for the end of the world. Then history took a sharp, unexpected turn. In December 1241, Ögedei Khan died in Mongolia. According to the Yasa, all princes of the blood had to return to the heartland for a Kurultai to elect a new leader. The Mongol armies, which were preparing to invade Italy and Austria, simply turned around and rode home. They never returned to Western Europe in force, but the shock they delivered changed European psychology forever. The West realized they were not the center of the world. They were merely the western tail of a massive, interconnected Eurasian continent. Part 4. The Pax Mongolica and the Great Exchange, 1260 to 1294 AD. The empire eventually split into 4 Great Khanates, the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai in Central Asia. But under the rule of Kublai Khan, the Great Khanate reached its most sophisticated cultural form. Kublai conquered the Southern Song dynasty, finally unifying all of China. A reset of the Chinese map that remains the foundation of its modern borders. He established the Yuan dynasty and moved the capital to Khanbalik, the city we now know as Beijing. This era, from 1260 to roughly 1350, is known as the Pax Mongolica. It was a period of unprecedented global connection. Because a single family, the Golden Family, controlled the entire span of the Silk Road, trade was safer than it had ever been. The Mongols issued paisas, golden or silver tablets that acted as diplomatic passports. A traveler with a paisa could walk from Paris to Beijing and expect food, fresh horses, and protection at every yam station. This connectivity triggered a great exchange of technology and biology. For example, the Chinese secret of woodblock printing moved west, reaching the Middle East and Europe, where it would eventually inspire the movable type of the Gutenberg press. Gunpowder, originally a Chinese alchemical curiosity used for firecrackers, moved along the Mongol routes to the Islamic world in Europe, where it was transformed from fire arrows into the first cannons. The magnetic compass, essential for the Mongol naval expeditions, traveled to the Mediterranean, eventually setting the technical stage for the age of sail. Furthermore, the Mongols were obsessed with knowledge. They moved experts across the continent like chess pieces. They sent Persian doctors to China to establish hospitals and brought Chinese engineers to Persia to build irrigation systems. In the Ilkhanate of Persia, scholars produced the most accurate astronomical tables the world had ever seen, which later influenced the work of Copernicus. This was the first time in history that the collective knowledge of humanity was being shared in real time. This was the world that Marco Polo walked into. When Polo spent 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, he saw a world that made Venice look like a village. He saw flying money, the world's first national paper currency system, which the Mongols enforced with the threat of death. He saw the use of black stones for fuel, and a postal system that was more efficient than anything in Europe. When he returned and published his travels, he wasn't just writing a book. He was providing a blueprint for Western desire. He proved that the East was not a land of monsters, but a land of unimaginable wealth and sophisticated technology. Part 5. The Maritime Expeditions and the Limits of Power, 1274 to 1293 AD. While the land-based Mongol Empire was almost invincible, Kublai Khan was the first Mongol ruler to look seriously at the sea. He realized that the wealth of the world was also carried on the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. He built massive shipyards in southern China and Korea, launching 2 of the largest naval invasions in human history against Japan in 1274 and 1281. Twice, his fleets were decimated by massive storms, the kamikaze or divine wind. These failures are often cited as the beginning of the end for the Yuan dynasty. But the Mongol naval reach didn't stop at Japan. They launched a massive expedition against the Kingdom of Java, modern-day Indonesia, in 1393, involving 1,000 ships and 20,000 men. Although the invasion was a tactical failure, it opened up permanent maritime trade routes between China and Southeast Asia. The Mongols also pushed into Vietnam and the Champa Kingdom. The jungle warfare of Southeast Asia was a nightmare for the Mongol cavalry, as the heat and humidity rotted their composite bows and killed their horses. They were eventually forced to withdraw, but not before they had brought these isolated kingdoms into the larger Eurasian diplomatic sphere. This period marked the furthest extent of the Mongol Reset, a moment when the empire touched the limits of the known world, from the forests of Poland to the jungles of Java. Part 6. The Shadow of the Road and the Biological Reset, 1300 to 1350 AD. The same roads that carried silk and science also carried a hidden passenger. In the early 14th century, the world's climate began to cool, an event known as the Little Ice Age. On the Central Asian steppe, This cooling forced rodents and fleas to migrate closer to human settlements. These fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. The very connectivity the Mongols had built now became a curse. The plague traveled the Yam system and the merchant caravans with terrifying speed. In 1346, the Golden Horde was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in the Crimea. As their own soldiers began dying of the plague, the Mongol commander, Janibeg, ordered his soldiers to use catapults to hurl the infected corpses over the city walls. This is one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare in history. The Italian merchants fled Kaffa by ship, sailing to Sicily and Venice, and unknowingly brought the apocalypse to Europe. The Black Death reset the world map in a very different way. It is estimated that 30 to 60% of Europe's population died in just a few years. In the Middle East and China, the toll was equally catastrophic. This decimated the tax base of the Mongol Khanates. Without a steady flow of tribute and trade, the Mongol administration began to crumble. The eternal blue sky was darkening, and the world was entering a century of chaos and contraction. Part 7, Fragmentation and the Rise of the Successor States, 1368 to 1480 AD. By the mid-14th century, the central authority of the Mongols had evaporated. In 1368, a former Buddhist monk and peasant leader named Zhu Yuanzhang led a rebellion that toppled the Yuan dynasty and established the Ming. The Ming reset the map of China by turning inward. They began the massive reconstruction of the Great Wall as we know it today, not as a tool of expansion, but as a desperate shield against the nomads of the north. China, which had been the most open and globalized society under the Mongols, began to close its doors, focusing on internal stability and Confucian orthodoxy. In the west, the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into a series of warring states. From this wreckage rose Timur, a man who claimed to be the sword of Islam and the heir to Genghis Khan. Timur was a brilliant but brutal conqueror who attempted to recreate the Mongol Empire one last time. He built a magnificent capital at Samarkand, filling it with the stolen artisans of the world. He defeated the rising Ottoman Turks and the Golden Horde, but his empire was built on his personality alone. When he died in 1405 on his way to invade China, his empire shattered almost instantly. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde in the north was losing its grip on the Russian princes. For centuries, the Russians had been tax collectors for the Mongols, but they were now using that wealth and administrative knowledge to build their own power. In 1480, at the Great Stand on the Ugra River, the Russian prince Ivan III refused to pay tribute. The two armies faced each other across the water for weeks, but the Mongols, weakened by internal strife and the loss of their southern trade routes, eventually turned and left. The Mongol yoke was over, and the modern, centralized Russian state was born, carrying with it the Mongol tradition of absolute executive power. Part 8. The persistence of the Khan from 1492 onwards. The Mongol Empire eventually faded from the map, but it had already finished its most important work. It had globalized the human race. The land routes of the Silk Road became dangerous again, as the Mongol peace dissolved into regional wars between the Ming, the Ottomans, and the Russians. But the memory of the East remained in the Western mind. European monarchs and merchants were now addicted to the spices of Indonesia, the silks of China, and the cottons of India. They had seen the wealth that was possible through global trade, because they could no longer travel safely by land through the former Mongol territories. They were forced to look to the sea. In 1492, Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish crown to fund a voyage west. He didn't think he was discovering a new world. He was carrying a worn, heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's book. His goal was to find a sea route to the court of the Great Khan. When he landed in the Caribbean, he spent his first weeks looking for the grand cities and gold-roofed palaces that Polo had described. The Age of Discovery was in many ways the final chapter of the Mongol Reset. The Mongols had forced the East and West together. When they left a vacuum that the European maritime empires rushed to fill. Today, the fingerprints of the Khan are everywhere. In our biology, geneticists have found that nearly 8% of men in the former Mongol Empire, roughly 16 million people, carry a Y chromosome that likely originated with Genghis Khan. In our politics, the modern borders of China, Russia, and Iran were all shaped by the administrative divisions of the Mongol Khanates. In our economy, the concept of a central bank, paper currency, and international diplomatic immunity all find their roots in the Mongol administration. The Mongol Empire was a violent, chaotic, and often terrifying era. It was a time of displacement and death on an unimaginable scale. But it was also the forge of the modern world. They took a fractured, isolated planet and hammered it into a single, interconnected map. They showed us that the horizon is not a wall, but a bridge. As we navigate our own era of global connection, we are still traveling on the roads they paved 800 years ago. The fire of the steppe eventually went out, but the heat it generated changed the temperature of history forever. We are all, in some sense, children of the Mongol Reset. Thank you for sticking till the end. We would greatly appreciate you subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button if you enjoy this type of content. Cheers!